stepped down from the position. Menzies Campbell has taken over as acting leader until party elections are held. Prior to question time, the House of Commons is wrapping up previous business. This is live coverage on C-SPAN 2.
Economy by having such events.
Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. John Mann.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, sir, before listing my engagements, may I say how sad we all were to learn of the death of Rachel Squire, the member for Dunfermline West Fife over the Christmas recess. She was a great servant to her constituents and won the respect of all who knew her for the brave and dignified way she fought her long illness, and she will be deeply missed. I hope I can also say, though he was no longer a member of this House, how much we're all going to miss Tony Banks. He was an extraordinary character, a unique personality, and someone who had many friends, I know, on all sides of the House. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in the House, I will have further such meetings later today.
John Mann.
On the one hand, Mr. Speaker, there's the Tory leader of Bassett Law Council, who believes that ASBOs should only be used as an absolute last resort. He's the kind of man who says that this law is all gimmick. On the other hand, there are the hundreds of residents who pack my public meetings on antisocial behaviour, who are demanding zero tolerance of thugs and bullies. I'm with the people on this one.
Quite right.
Is the Prime Minister, and if so, will he hold those fully to account who fail to fully use these powers?
Well, I think most people believe that the use of antisocial behaviour orders, the powers to close crack houses, the use of fixed penalty notices have had a huge impact where they've been used properly in local communities, obviously combined with extra numbers of police and community support officers. And I urge very strongly all local authorities and local police to use those powers to the full. And as we made clear with the action plan we published yesterday, more powers will be available if needed. They're important, they make a real difference to communities, and they're absolutely in line with what local people want.
David Cameron.
Can I associate myself with what the Prime Minister said about Rachel Squire? She'll be missed on all sides of the House, and particularly noted for her very good work on defence. I also agree with him about Tony Banks, his commitment to sport, his legendary wit, often directed about people trying to do my job. Personally, I also have fond memories of Merlin Rees, the respected former Labour Home Secretary who died recently. Believe it or not, I remember going with him to the Republican Party convention in America in 1992. I think he must have been New Labour before the term was properly invented. Mr. Speaker, the decision by Iran yesterday to break the seals of its nuclear facility has caused widespread concern. What steps does the Prime Minister propose to take to maximise the international consensus for taking this issue to the United Nations Security Council?
First of all, let me say there will be a meeting of the European ministers tomorrow, and we will discuss how we take this forward now. But the decision by Iran is very serious indeed. I don't think there is any point in people or us hiding our deep dismay at what Iran has decided to do. And when taken in conjunction with their other comments about the state of Israel, they cause real and serious alarm right across the world. So the meeting will take place tomorrow. We obviously are discussing this closely as well with our American allies. But a reference to the Security Council is entirely in line with what the Atomic Energy Authority itself decided some time ago, when the only reason it suspended a reference to the Security Council was because Iran had suspended its enrichment facilities. And this is why it is extremely important, therefore, that we take a fresh look at this now.
David Cameron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, if the issue does go to the United Nations Security Council, and we hope that it does, one of the issues will be sanctions. The Prime Minister well knows that sanctions in the past have not always been effective in getting countries to comply with their international obligations. What steps will he take to make sure they are effective in this case?
I think the first thing to do is to secure agreement for a reference to the Security Council, if that is indeed what the Allies jointly decide, as I think seems likely. Then at that point we have to decide what measures we're going to take. And we obviously don't rule out any measures at all. It's important that Iran recognises how seriously the international community treats it. But I think we are better to go through the process of first having the meetings and discussion and reaching agreement, and then we can set out what measures we want to take.
David Cameron.
I'm sure the Prime Minister is right about what he says in terms of following the process. And the aim we all share here is non-proliferation. But isn't it the case, as he says, that Iran has not only taken steps repeatedly to acquire nuclear weapons, but has also made the very damaging remarks that he referred to, threatening remarks about the future of Israel? Given that, doesn't that underline the case for actually stepping up our efforts to encourage pluralism, a civic society, and liberal and progressive culture in Iran itself?
I've no doubt at all that when we look at these issues, there are two things that we have to do. First of all, we have to take immediate steps to protect the security of the world, and that's why a potential reference to the Security Council is important. That is absolutely right. And the breaking of the seals is a very important act. The statements on Israel are important statements that I'm afraid indicate a malign intention on the part of the Iranian regime. I think, however, the second thing is the long-term issue of how we best protect the security of the world, and I have no doubt at all there that the best long-term security for us is the spread of freedom and democracy and values that all civilized people share. And the important thing about the recent elections in Afghanistan and again in Iraq is that they dispose once and for all of the myth that somehow democracy is something that Western people want, but those in other cultures do not want. In fact, democracy and freedom are values of the human spirit, they're universal values, and I do believe that we have learnt enough from our international diplomacy over the past few decades to recognise that the only long-term stable partners for countries like this, like Britain, and for countries like the United States of America and our other allies in Europe, the only long-term stable partners are those that share our values.
David Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is my right honourable friend aware that Glasgow City Council and the Scottish Executive has just launched their bid to attract the 2014 Commonwealth Games to Glasgow? Will the Prime Minister replicate the excellent assistance which he gave to the successful campaign to obtain the 2012 Olympics for London, and do all he can to ensure that the 2014 Commonwealth Games do come to Glasgow?
Glasgow make an excellent venue for the Commonwealth Games. Scottish people are passionate about sport, and as we learned from the Commonwealth Games in Manchester, the Commonwealth Games have a unifying impact on the whole of the country too. So I wish the Glasgow bid well, and we'll obviously support it in any way we can.
Sir Mingus Campbell.
And a very happy new year to all of you as well. May I begin by associating myself with the observations made by the Prime Minister about Tony Banks and Rachel Squire. Tony Banks was a rare talent who enlivened the lives of us all, particularly his own Chief Whip. And Rachel Squire, who was my neighbouring MP in Fife, was a woman of immense dedication and latterly of extraordinary courage. Her constituents have truly lost a champion. But can I direct the Prime Minister to this? The National Audit Office today reports that 1 million pupils are being failed by our schools. The Health Select Committee has described the latest proposals for health service reform as ill-judged. And the police are up in arms about his costly proposals for centralisation. Why is the government making such a mess of public service reform?
First of all, let me just point out what, in addition, the National Audit Office report says, because let us have a balanced discussion of the record over the past 8 years. It's correct. They talk about 1 million children not getting the education they need. That is out of a total of almost 8 million. But this is also what they find, that over the past 8 years, the number of failing schools has been halved by this government. The number of schools in serious weaknesses has been more than halved. The number of secondary schools getting below 30% 5 good GCSEs has fallen from 900 in 1997 to just 340 in 2005. And the numbers of good leaders and managers within the schools has risen from 56% in 1997 to 75% today. In addition, all the results at 11, at 16, at 18 are better than they were in 1997. In addition, every single health service waiting list indicator, inpatient and outpatient, is better than it was in 1997. In addition, there are record numbers of police and crime has fallen over the past 8 years of this government. So I think public service reform and investment is doing very well.
Well, while the Prime Minister is anxious to achieve some balance in the argument, perhaps he'd like to explain why it is that 1 in 5 schools do not have a permanent head teacher. When the Prime Minister entered number 10 Downing Street, Mr. Speaker, I just knew it was going to be one of those days. When the Prime Minister entered number 10 Downing Street, he rightly abandoned socialism. But hasn't Blairism become a byword for centralisation and a failure to deliver?
Well, first of all, on the heads vacancies, as he knows, it can be difficult to find the head of an organisation when the post is vacant, particularly if it's a failing organisation. But actually, if he is in favour of greater devolution of power, then presumably he then supports our choice agenda in the NHS and supports our schools white paper, which gives more powers to schools.
Stephen McCabe.
Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister agree that whilst there has been considerable progress in tackling antisocial behaviour, there are still too many decent people in places like Hall Green who don't receive proper prompt assistance when they need it? Far from being a knee-jerk gimmick, isn't the Respect Action Plan about recognising these weaknesses, offering them proper redress, and above all, showing them that we at least are on their side?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right, and of course he's right to point out that for local communities, they need these additional powers. In particular, yesterday, we are suggesting extending the power that's now available to shut down houses used for drug dealing, to be able to shut down homes that are used for persistent antisocial behaviour, and that is important to do. It's also right, however, that we deal with some of the underlying causes, and that, of course, is why we've doubled the number of people who are able to go into programmes that treat their drug addiction. It's why we've got Sure Start and the New Deal for local communities. But what is important is to make sure that these communities have the powers they need, and the police and local authorities use them, and I entirely agree with them. These are not gimmicks, as someone said yesterday. They are actually absolutely vital parts of local communities reclaiming order on their streets for those communities.
David Cameron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by welcoming the new acting leader of the Lib Dem, something that the Prime Minister failed to do. I hope this is not becoming habit-forming. Interim or otherwise, those of us who've recently been through these contests will look forward to watching while this one takes place. Mr. Speaker, this year more than 2 million people are likely to die from AIDS, most of them in Africa. The international community is now rightly committed to ensuring that all HIV/AIDS sufferers have access to treatment by 2010. But will the Prime Minister consider setting interim goals between now and 2010 to make sure that this vital target, is actually hit?
I mean, look, first of all, I should, of course, welcome the right honourable gentleman. I'll give him an even bigger welcome if it becomes permanent, not temporary. Don't take that as a... Sorry. it would probably be easy if I rejected him entirely, would it? Well, I'm happy to do that. In respect of the AIDS programme, well, the reason why we've set the target of as close as possible, because it's necessarily there's got to be some discretion in this, but as close as possible to full coverage by 2010, is that is the best we believe we can do, building up the programme over the next few years, and we're about to increase massively. The Global Health Fund, I think, has just agreed with $4 billion for the killer diseases, and we want to build up the programme as quickly as possible. I mean, I think it's difficult for me, frankly, to set targets for year by year. Well, on behalf of other countries, but in respect of our own programme, we are trebling aid to Africa over the next few years, and actually the numbers of people we are helping with HIV, AIDS, retroviral drugs and others is increasing the entire time. So I think this country has an awful lot to be proud of in what it's doing in relation to HIV, AIDS. And I'll certainly look at what he suggests, but it's difficult for me to take responsibility for what other countries are going to contribute, particularly to the Global Health Fund.
Well, for the answer, but I think the Prime Minister could play a role, because DFID is actually co-chairing the UN committee that is looking at the targets. And the Prime Minister will know that the last target to help people with HIV/AIDS was catastrophically missed. The target was for 3 million people to have access to antiretroviral drugs by 2005, and yet in the event around only 1 million will have actually received those drugs. So will he look again at the case for having interim targets, because it makes it more likely to hit the 2010 target that we all want to see happen?
As I say, I'm perfectly happy to look at it, but I think it's for the reasons I've given, it's difficult for us to start giving precise targets for measures that will include other countries as well. However, let me just come back to what he said. Can't we do more on HIV/AIDS? This country has led the way on overseas aid and development in the past 8 years. Might I just remind him, when we came to office, actually the development aid budget had been falling. This country was way behind other countries in our profile on overseas aid and development. Thanks to the work that the Chancellor has done, the development secretary, successive development secretaries have done, this country now leads the way on debt relief in relation to aid, in relation to treatment of the killer diseases. And at Gleneagles, as he knows, at the G8 summit, we agreed a comprehensive action plan, the first of its kind for Africa. So I can assure him, I need absolutely no instruction from him or anyone else. We will carry on doing everything we can in order to promote action on Africa. And I am pleased, I have to say, that at long last the Conservative Party is joining with us in that.
Mark Henricks.
Is my right honourable friend aware that in the Cumbria and Lancashire Strategic Health Authority, the number of people waiting between 6 and 9 months has fallen from 7,593 to just 301, a fall of 96% since 1997.
They don't like it.
Of course, it's not just those waiting for that length of time where the waiting lists have fallen. Waiting lists have now fallen in the National Health Service for every single one of the main indicators. When we came to office, there were literally hundreds of thousands of people waiting on inpatient lists for 9 months or over 6 months. Those figures have come down dramatically now. There's a maximum of 6 months. We will go further and get to the 18-week door-to-door. That's in an outpatient list by the end of 2008. And an honourable member was saying, what about outpatients? Well, I can give them the figures on outpatients as well. Actually, on outpatients, we've also done extremely well. On outpatients, when we first came to office, there were 157,000 people waiting for over half a year on an outpatient list at any one time. Now there's none. And there were 97,000 waiting over 17 plus weeks, and now there's just over 200. There were 338,000 waiting over 13 weeks, now it's 40,000. So there's been dramatic improvement across the whole range of in and outpatient times, and the only reason for that is it has been as a result of the investment and reform programme pursued by this government and actually opposed by the party opposite.
Simon Hughes.
If the National Health Service is doing as well as the Prime Minister is trying to persuade us, Why does Oxfordshire NHS patient Mr. Mike Collins have to borrow £10,000 to go private to get the heart treatment he needs?
First of all, let me welcome him to whatever position it is that he holds. But let me say to him, I entirely accept there are still people who are waiting too long. That's the very reason why we set out a programme over a number of years to reduce the numbers of people on waiting lists. And whereas when we came to office, people would wait over 18 months, there's now a maximum of 6 months. That will be taken further. But let me tell the honourable gentleman, the only reason we've been able to do that is because of the extra investment, is because of the change. Now, in respect of the reform programme in the National Health Service, and let me say to him that the waiting list began to fall dramatically in London and elsewhere when we introduced the choice agenda. His Liberal Democrat Party, well, not his Liberal Democrat Party, but the Liberal Democrat, let's not be presumptuous, but the Liberal Democrat Party has opposed every single... Well, he's shaking his head. They have done. Well, it's a U-turn then. It's good.
Which one is it?
Well, I think if he's going to back our reform, I'm going to start backing him rather than the other one. Yeah. There's no end to the Liberal Democrat careers I could sacrifice this afternoon. Where's the other one? Just telling this, the Liberal Democrats have got some hard thinking to do over the next few months.
Dr. Palmer, Nick Palmer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister congratulate Nottinghamshire and Nottingham councils for receiving the award of the best performing local transport plan in Britain, and will he reward that by an early decision on the extension to the tram network? We've been waiting for more than a year. Supporters and opponents are equally frustrated. We need a decision.
Well, I'm looking at the Minister with the reward, no doubt locked away in a vault somewhere. But I have to say to my friend, I'll have to get back to him on that. I don't know the current position with the tram programme, but I will get in touch with him very swiftly and remedy that ignorance.
Greg Hans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In October 2004, the Prime Minister rightly praised the staff of the Hammersmith Hospitals Trust after his own operation there. What would be his message to staff and patients today, given the news of a loss of 300 jobs, Macmillan cancer nurses being assigned directly to the wards, and the Trust having the second largest deficit in England of a massive £37 million?
First of all, I think, in all fairness, he would want to give the other side of the story, which is that also there have been almost 4,000 more nurses, 500 more consultants and more GPs in his area since 1997, and that there's an increase in real terms of 7% in the funding. Now, I agree that there is a deficit in that particular trust, and it is a very large deficit, and it's worth just pointing out that it's with 4% of the NHS organisations are responsible for 50% of the overall deficit. Oh. The majority of NHS organisations are in surplus or breaking even. But it's correct that we look at each one of those that is in deficit and see what can be done. But I hope he would recognise this is not just an obligation for government, it's also an obligation on the Trust for proper financial management.
Jim Sheridan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency, yet another company, Inventec, announced yesterday that they're transferring their manufacturing facility to Eastern Europe with the loss of some 370 jobs. Does my right honourable friend agree with many on this side of the House that British workers deserve just a little bit more protection when these decisions have been made by faceless people driven by corporate greed and the exploitation of cheap labour?
Well, first of all, can I say to my honourable friend, I very much regret the job losses at Inventec, and I know that Inventec have been working closely with Scottish Enterprise, who are ready to step in with the support services for those affected by the change. And I also know that the authorities there are ready to put together a package of support and help for people because of the situation of redundancy that they face. I have to say to him that it's important, however, also to recognise that over the past few years there's been a huge increase in the number of jobs in Scotland. I know that is no consolation to those that have lost their jobs at Inventec, but we will do everything we possibly can to help people with retraining and finding new work.
Robert Goodwill.
The government seems to be content that an increasing number of convicted criminals are escaping a custodial sentence. As he embarks on what may well be his final full year in office, is the Prime Minister bothered that a pensioner with a minimal amount of unpaid council tax is more likely to go to jail than some muggers?
He's actually wrong about that. The prison population has risen considerably over the past few years. I don't think that's a particular boast for any government, but actually people are being given custodial sentences. Sentences are there for the court to decide, and over the past few years there's been an increase in the numbers running into thousands of more people being given custodial sentences. It's also true that the detection rates are rising, and that is good news.
Siobhan McDonagh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What advice would my right honourable friend give to parents in my constituency who've recently received a leaflet encouraging them to oppose academy schools, delivered by Merton Conservatives?
I think, in fairness to Merton Conservatives, Conservative policy changes so quickly nowadays that they may have a little difficulty keeping up with it. But as I understood it, it was the policy of the Conservative leader, at least yesterday, to support the Academy programme, and I hope he will intervene with Merton Conservatives and tell them how important it is to have academies which can offer real opportunities to some of the poorest kids in the inner cities.
Iris Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister recall telling the House at his last question time on the 14th of December, I quote, "Obviously, we were not consulted about this matter when referring to charges being dropped against IRA members accused of being involved in the Stormont spy ring. As the Attorney-General has now written to the leader of my party on the 22nd of December, saying, I consulted ministerial colleagues. Would the Prime Minister now like to come clean about the extent of that consultation?"
I don't know the particular element that she's referring to there. All I can say is, as far as I'm aware, certainly I was not consulted on whether this prosecution should be dropped or not. And I was certain, well, I'm perfectly happy to look at I haven't actually studied the letter myself that's been put in the library of the House of Commons. I will do so and I will write to her.
Andrew Miller.
Our honourable friend, the member for Eastwood, the Cabinet Office Minister, is, I understand, publishing a new bill today on regulatory reform, and trailering this in the Financial Times this morning, he says that this is one of the most radical regulatory reform agendas in the world. Will my right honourable friend assure me that all government departments will be actively engaged in this process, because I think a lot of steps can be taken to improve regulation in this country if that occurs?
Well, I certainly do give him that assurance, and the result of this bill, it will make it quicker and easier to remove outdated or unnecessary legislation, but it also makes it possible to implement the Law Commission recommendations. Most of all, as the Chancellor indicated before, we want to take a risk-based approach to regulation, and this bill will allow us to do that. He will recall that we introduced regulatory reform legislation before. We have managed to withdraw some regulation under that, but frankly, we need to do better, and I think this new regulatory reform bill should commend itself, I hope it does, to all sides of the House.
Richard Benyon.
In his last few months in office, will the Prime Minister look at the grotesque unfairness of the government grant allocation to local authorities, which sees council taxpayers in West Berkshire receiving approximately a third of the amount per head of non-schools grant allocation compared with council taxpayers in parts of the northeast of England? Will he explain to elderly...
One supplementary is all that's allowed. Prime Minister.
Well, but surely his local authority has indeed received more money over the past few years, both in real terms and significant amounts of additional money. And indeed, I understand in respect of education, for example, that there's an extra £1,320 in funding per pupil in his area in the last few years. Now, I entirely agree. Maybe it should be more. That's what we want to do. We want to increase the investment going into our public services. But I might just remind him that he actually fought an election promising to reduce the investment we're putting in.
Martin Salter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Prime Minister launched the Respect Action Plan to give communities better opportunities to tackle crime, drugs and antisocial behaviour. Does he recognise that in Reading, under the dynamic leadership of the local Labour Council, supported by the Chief Superintendent Dave Murray, excellent progress has been made in cutting crime through the use of antisocial behaviour orders and getting drug-addicted criminals into treatment programmes? How will his Respect Action Plan help us in Reading and across the country do even better?
Well, my honourable friend is right. There is dynamic leadership in Reading that has indeed delivered the action on antisocial behaviour that he describes. The important thing is that the powers that we've outlined yesterday build on that. So, for example, they extend the ability to give fixed penalty notices. There are tougher actions in relation to homes that are used for antisocial behaviour and in respect of antisocial behaviour, particularly by younger kids. And he's completely right that in Reading, in other areas I've seen for myself recently, in East Manchester or Harlow, again in Swindon yesterday, where these powers are being used by local authorities, local police and local residents, they're making a real difference. And anybody who believes they're simply a gimmick or some knee-jerk populism should actually go to these areas, hear what the